Good morning. Now, raise your hand if you understood that. Okay, good start. Ahora, por ejemplo, si jo decidiera hablar en espanyol i desear-vos a tots uns muy buenos días, o si, per exemple, em poso a parlar en català i us demano a tothom que tingueu un molt bon dia, please raise your hand if you still understood that. Great. Amazing. Now, let's try forsitan mirror quid fiet ciego salve dicam vobis. Who understood that? Okay, we still have some. It is an answer after all. And what if I say this? Ellen sila lumen omenti elvo. Do you have anyone raising their hand? Some hands. Okay, one hand. Amazing. I'm going to be very surprised with that last greeting. If someone understands when I say to you, frethur redrivi vir, zejulis iatelis. So what just happened? We started with some old-fashioned English, went on to Spanish, went on to Catalan, then we did some Latin, and then some Elvish, and Draurur, okay? So there's two here that they're not like the others. There's two different ones here, right? So basically, these last two languages are fictional languages, okay? And that is what the topic of our talk today. So that's what a lot of you are going to be thinking if you think of the term fictional languages, fantasy languages, conlangs, artificial language, whatever you want to call it. Basically a language that's made by a single person for a fictional world and that is not actually spoken by people. Okay? A lot of you are going to be familiar with The Lord of the Rings. In the beginning, Tolkien sort of like introduces us to his world by literally greeting it in its own language, right? So we get sucked in this world where we're basically involved and enveloped in this sort of like language that makes the world feel not only realistic, but real. Okay, so this is a very complex end that the languages can get to, but today I'm here to tell you that languages, fictional languages, are actually an essential part of storytelling, and a lot more common than you think. And for that, we're going to do a little exercise. So I'm going to ask all of you to close your eyes, please. And just, imagine you just bought a book, don't know anything about it, and you open it and it says, there was a castle. Now, everyone imagine a castle, so whatever comes to mind, and you can open your eyes now. This is what I call the castle problem, okay? So, some of you here, maybe you were Disney or you've, been to Neuschwanstein, and you're imagining something like that. Maybe you just went traveling around Scotland, and your idea of a castle looks a little bit more like this. But maybe you've just been traveling, or you come from somewhere very far away, and your idea of a castle is a little bit more like this. And maybe even your culture and the media that you've consumed since you were little makes your castle look like Hogwarts, which is probably what would happen to me. But, you have these sort of like different ideas of what a castle is. And what if I now told you that the castle that I was telling you about is blue? Or that it's very high, or that it's upside down, or that it's underwater, right? What I'm trying to say is that all these words, all the words in our languages have a cultural baggage. They all come with an intrinsic amount of things that get attached to it beyond the meaning of the word. Words don't exist in a vacuum. They exist with like a bunch of cultural baggage with it, right? Their languages are thousands of years old, and they bring a lot of baggage with it. And that, for storytellers, is a problem. Because, you're a storyteller, you have an idea. And your idea is perfect. I think that all ideas are beautiful and perfect when they're in someone's mind. But the problem comes when you have to write it down, when you have to say it, when you have to sort of like transmit it in any way, because then you have to translate it. Your idea has a certain shape, but the language that you're native in, the language that you choose to write in, doesn't necessarily have to have the same shape as this one. Okay, and that's what the idea with the castle, right? Maybe you go to English and you're like, okay, I want to write for my castle. Maybe you have castle, keep, fortress. You have a few words for it, but you don't have an exact word for the castle that you're thinking of. And so you have to do an act of translation. You have to make a choice. And a little bit is lost there. There's a little bit of the idea that gets lost in that process. Now, if it was only for castle, then it wouldn't be a problem. But if it's for every word, it's for every adjective, every noun, every verb, every moment that you're translating something from the language of your mind to the language of whatever your Spanish, English, whatever you're trying to say it in, that loss is significant. And you could even say that a great writer is basically just a very good translator of his own mind into writing, right? But there's an alternative, which is skipping that part and going directly from your mind to an idea, to a language that's actually made around the shape of your idea, and that actually is perfectly suited to the cultural context of the world of your story. Okay, this is largely true for fantasy, but also true for other kinds of fiction. And so, let's start to see how you make a language, and then we'll see how it can be useful. So we'll start to see how. And for this, I'd like to introduce you to Draurur. Okay, so Draurur is my latest language. Very new, very sort of like elaborate, state-of-the-art language, right? So we have like infinitives, we have grammar, we have pronouns, orthography, we have diphthongs, everything that you could imagine that a language like grammatically has. It has accents, it even has meter, it even has sort of like poetic different genres, right? So we very, very, very elaborate. It has everything that the language would need. It even has an alphabet, right? So you for instance, this here would be translated into Draurur. This is what we would call a transliteration, but the true translation of this would be this, right? Obviously, a language, in order for it to be truly itself, needs to be in its own alphabet, because it basically is just, it is basically, the language, the Italic language is just, at the end, it's a borrowed language that you're still taking from a real world, not your world. So So you need to have your own alphabet for it. And so we have the tools now. We have everything. We have the grammar, we have the vocab, we have the alphabet, we have everything. But that language is not alive yet. That language is just a set of rules. It's just a set of ideas, but it's not alive in the way that languages are. And now we're going to see how to make it alive. The first thing is to consider this amount of things that you've done as a starting point. What you could call an archaic version of that language, an old version of that language, because languages do start like this. They start being extremely formal. And so you, for instance, let's say you've made your language, and in your language, like certain like glyphs are almost like symbols for things at the beginning, right? Like, so the glyphs and what we now eventually call letters start, like, they mean something, right? Like, they stand for something. So, you have these, and then out of these, maybe you do some like proto first words that like are like just like meanings of these things put together. You're probably thinking of hieroglyphics, and then you put like some evil sort of like sounds, and that sort of like starts to influencing the language and starts to create it. But when the language truly starts to come alive is when you practice, right? So let me put an example. Let's say you're learning Portuguese. So you've memorized a bunch of grammar, you've memorized a bunch of vocab, and you got everything, but still don't know the language, right? What do you have to do now? You have to practice. Making a language is the same as learning a language. It's practice. And by practice, when you start practicing with your language, something magical happens. Suddenly, the language starts to evolve. Thousands of years are passing before your eyes, because as you sort of like make it, the natural evolution of that language starts to develop, right? So let's say that you've made a dative plural, an ending that's just a very sort of like complex and like just a very sort of like large ending. And then that ending is just very cumbersome to be putting into like verse or to be putting in with that thing. So the I, maybe you just take it out because it's easier for you, Maybe that structure of that like infinitive and that thing, that's also too complicated. So you basically are making it easier for yourself, and you're doing the same process that all languages undergo. They just take thousands of years, and you're doing it in every sort of like thing that you act, in every act that you do, right? Luckily for me, this guy over here is a character from my book that loves writing letters. So he writes letters to the king, to his tax collector, to his friends, to his family, everyone, right? Formal letters, informal registers. We have different vocabs for different things. He talks about his garden, he talks about his birds, he talks about politics. And by doing so, I translate those letters. And it's an amazing way for the language to slowly come alive in an organic, natural way, right? So I'm just going to put an example. For instance, this is one of his letters, just a regular letter that doesn't really talk about much of anything. But for instance, let's say that here he talks about, his garden, right? Or like his things. And then you realize that hey, I don't have enough words for, let's say, botanical concepts. Maybe I don't have enough words for roses and rose bushes and these sorts of things. I have to make them, you know? Maybe I don't have enough, maybe this construction of like a past within a past, of this past perfect, also doesn't work. You have to make it. So it gets made in the same way as a natural language would, right? So for instance, this would be the English version. Here you would have the transliterated version. And then here would be the final translation that they would have been writing it in. And so it's practice. Learning a language is practice. Making a language is practice. And one of the interesting things is that every little moment, every little word that you make, which is thousands of them, is an act of creation, is a sort of like exercising your creative muscle, right? And each of them is important. So there's a lot of linguists that compare languages to trees, right? So language is a tree, and the words are all of its leaves. But in order for a tree to look alive, the leaves have to all look alive as well. And so that's what you have to do. You have to give life to every single leaf. And it is a process that requires a lot of patience, but it is also a very rewarding process. I'm just going to put some examples of what I mean when I say that like a word is alive. And it essentially has to do with etymology. So, for instance, let's just look at some examples. So this is graja. Graja would stand for almond. And just, so just a symbol word for almond, or like a family of almonds, and inherited from this word, gret, which means small particle, dust. So this is a word that's getting its name from its physical characteristics. It's one of the ways that a word can get it. And then maybe the root grut appears somewhere else for sun or for something else. So the word is being connected through those branches to the overall sort of like language, and your intuitive mind is picking up on that when you see all the different things. Another example, Surecia, right? That's a lemon, and that is basically, there's a region called Silesia. There's lemons there. They went there. They found lemons. What do we call this? We're going to call this Silesia. A lot of the times, words just the origin of words is just that simple. So this is what we would call a toponym, for instance. And I'm just going to put another example, which is, for instance, Genesta. Here in St. Andrews, I'm sure you've been seeing the daffodils in bloom. And for instance, this would be their word for daffodil. So in this case, it's called a theonym, which is basically a name that gets its sort of like origin from a cultural or sort of like a divine background, a myth, a legend, some sort of stuff. In this case, Genesta literally means tears of the mother, tears of the goddess of the sun. Okay, mother is just an epithet for their goddess Telinia. So this would literally just mean tears of the goddess of the sun for their bright yellow color. So it is an act of creation, every little single word, and every time it gets easier, and it gets sort of like more fulfilling as you have more roots and more of everything. So we've seen, how to make it. We have a pretty good idea how to make it, but I still haven't talked about why it's sort of like useful. Like, let's say that you don't care about this language. Let's say that you're just sort of like interested in the actual story that takes place in your language, the language that you're reading, your story. Okay, well, I'm going to show you how it's still an amazing and very powerful tool to improve your actual story. So we'll take this, for instance. This is part of an epic poem inside of the book, okay? So you could even say like their Iliad, and it's just sort of like this epic poem. And you find here that when you're writing an epic poem, especially in translation, as it appears in the book, you want to have a certain like archaicized language. So you have, if you read the Iliad, for instance, you read of like Achilles of brightly shining helmet, or Hera of cow-eyed Hera, right? These things are artificial in English. They're artificial, sort of like they look unnatural, and that's what makes them epic, right? That's what gives it its grandeur, its epicness, because you see it and you get the sense that this is not actually from your language. This is from an earlier, powerful language, where things are said differently. You want to mimic that when you're doing an epic poem, for instance, and you can try to mimic it. Maybe you're a better writer, maybe you're a worse writer. You can do a bit better or worse, but it's still, you just mimic it, right? But what if you translate it to the other language, and here you get a bunch of problems, right? Like, oh, the meter, this word doesn't fit here, has to go down, has to go up. This word here, maybe you find a cool like alliteration that you can do for a while. Maybe you find certain like epithets that appear with the meter here. You get a lot of, the language just changes. The story just changes completely. And you could keep it here, but the other thing that you can do is then translate it back. And now you're getting so much more richness in the language, especially when you put this epic poem in like sort of like the context of the rest of the epic. You start to see repetitions. You start to see things that get sort of like repeated in a structure that's not your own structure, because it's a structure that it's borrowing from here. And your intuitive brain that we were talking about before, that is a lot more intelligent than your rational brain, is picking up on those little differences, and it's telling you, this is real. Not realistic. We're not looking for realism in fantasy. Okay? We're looking for magic in fantasy. But it's not realistic, but it's real. It tells you that it's real. And at the end of the day, that's what you try to do with fantasy. You're trying to convince that person while they're in that world that this thing that you're looking at, that this place where you're at is real while you're here. And language is just, fictional language is a very powerful way of doing that. And just now at the end, I wanted to show you this because this is the poem that you just saw, so this thing here. This is its full sort of portrayal in the way that they would have portrayed it, okay? In its cultural context, this is what we would call an illuminated manuscript. And, well, to me, this represents a triumph in fictional languages, because it shows that fictional languages are not just sort of like a little like nerdy trick that you do, but they're actually an artwork. They're actually an art form, and they marry together a lot of powerful art forms like calligraphy, design, painting, but also linguistics, and obviously, most importantly, literature. So make a language. Make a language for all the reasons that I've told you, but especially make a language because it's going to be your own language. It's going to be the language that's inside you. You know, and when you walk around TEDxUniversityofStAndrews, for instance, you're going to see the daffodils, and you're not going to be seeing the daffodils. You're going to be seeing tears of a goddess. You are going to be seeing a deer, and you're not going to see a deer. You're going to be looking at the eyes of a queen. You will, and especially to the storyteller, you're going to be looking at your own story in its language, and you're not going to be seeing a story. You're going to be seeing your own story, the story that's inside you for the first time. And it's pretty beautiful. So, thank you.